All right, so in this clip, we are going to discuss some of the basics of this course. We're going to start to kind of try to understand what I mean by a strategic group. So immediately you should be thinking, well, why are these three firms that my professor assigned me somehow related? I mean, but look at them. They're all in the same industry, of course. So that's kind of the key starting point, that they do something similar. Okay, let's jump right in. All right, so what we're going to be doing here is a couple of things. From the economic standpoint, we're trying to really understand why firms do what they do. There's a backline premise here, and that is that firms are very specific in the actions they take, and also that they don't always have to be doing everything at once. We'll get to more of that in the coming presentations. The management component is to say, how do firms react and how do firms make decisions when the environment changes? We know that the environment just is not stagnant. Everything around us is changing. Political events are changing. Cultural requirements are changing. The inputs to make the products or provide the services are constantly changing. Valuations are changing. So business managers have to figure out, what am I going to do to figure out how not to get destroyed by all of these changes? Okay, so we get to take this kind of two lens approach in this course, and when you conduct your strategic analysis with your groups, that's the kind of that's the voice that I'm hoping comes through in the work that you write. Okay, so why do these actions they take make sense, and what are the actions they're taking to deal with this environment? Okay, so here are a couple of ideas that are the back premises of this course. Let's read these together. How is it that firms who produce similar or near identical products or services exist simultaneously and through time? Okay, so what I mean by this is, if you look around at the economic environment in which we live, there are thousands and thousands of companies. And when you start to drill into specific industries, you see that companies actually basically do almost the same things in a lot of cases. They do the same service, they provide the same product. So how can they exist simultaneously? There's a number of immediate answers that might come to your head, but we're going to be looking at the other side of the question, not just about the products, but how do they exist at the same time as a competitor? Okay, so the next question. How do firms deal with internal and external changes in their supply chain? So all the things that make up the product or service that they provide, industry, all of the companies that they are competing with, both directly and indirectly, and this larger macro environment. How about changes in Federal Reserve policy? How about changes in taxation? How about changes in types of regulations that a company might face? How are companies going to deal with that so that, again, they can exist through time? All right, so leading to the next question. How do firms react? How do they protect themselves? How do they change their environment? Okay, so immediately you should be kind of thinking, oh yeah, those guys lobbyists. They're very important to make sure that companies get to do what they want and are able to continue to do what they want. Or things like trade associations, or things like becoming giant multinational companies that are spanning across countries and spanning across product lines so that they may not face a loss in all of their product areas at once. Okay. And lastly, we could ask how, why, and when do firms change? So even if they had figured it out, even if they had been profitable for the last 80, 90 years, sometimes you have to change entirely. So when, why, and how do they do it? These are the questions we're going to be looking at. Okay. What we're going to see, though, is that we don't need to study entire industries to conduct a competitive analysis. In fact, that really wouldn't be all that smart. It's like if you were going to start a new business. Think of some type of product or service. My head always goes to food. So, boy, I'm hungry now, and you know what sounds good is a nice bowl of ramen. Well, if I wanted to start a ramen business in Kansas City, I wouldn't just blindly say it's going to be successful. I would need to start to think of who my competitors are and where are they. Does that mean that I need to be thinking about all the barbecue restaurants? Kind of, but more specifically, I want to focus on companies that are producing soups. You get my drift. So we can start to consider the idea of strategic positioning. It's firms within the same industries They can position themselves in different ways. They can try to avoid looking exactly like all the other competitors. We have to realize that not all these positions are the same profitability. You can have giant companies producing multi-billions of dollars of revenue, and you can have companies that produce very little and yet still exist in the same industry. So, where a firm places themselves will depend upon all of those characteristics of the industry and also will, in some sense, determine their profitability. This leads us to the idea of strategic groups. You should be thinking the three firms that Professor Wagner chose, that's my strategic group. Let's look at some basics. Is Keith Stone immediately competing with Boulevard? Yes, they both are producing beer. But there's something different about them. Okay, we know that this is a different audience. So amazingly, we have the situation where the production process is nearly identical, and yet does Boulevard immediately care about the clientele of Keith Stone? Well, maybe going forward now, we'll talk about beer quite a bit in this class, but for the last 30 years, Boulevard enjoyed a status that said, I don't compete with them because I am not like them. Let's look at a few more examples that might help this all come clear. Is Applebee's competing with Ruth Chris? They're both steakhouses. They both exist in the restaurant industry. They probably have the same supplier chains. They probably use the same equipment. All the things to provide their products is almost identical. And yet, they are not truly competitors. They have a different atmosphere. They have different requirements of who goes there. They have different price points. They have different industry specifics in terms of labor requirements. They have different names and status and costs and so forth. So we can see that maybe Applebee's isn't necessarily thinking so much about Ruth Chris and vice versa. Okay, well, this looks a little bit closer, but even then, you're starting to see that while, yes, they both sell hamburgers, there's something that's going to be fundamentally different between these two companies. And also, it says McDonald's may not necessarily care so much about what Applebee's does. For example, if Applebee's had a one time sale, would you see McDonald's react with some one time sale? Most likely not. Okay, so let's get in closer. Ah, there we go. This is starting to look a little bit more like who is competing with each other. Now you can kind of see what I'm talking about here. These four firms are almost identical. The way that they're built is almost identical. Where they locate is almost identical. The supply chain. I bet that supplier, that Cisco food, drops off at one location and moves right next door in every strip mall in America you could ever imagine. So much of similarity is found between these four firms. And so we could probably design them as a strategic group and actually start to study how they behave in this group. Okay, if we wanted to break it out and be a little less specific, here is the entire idea of the restaurant industry. And you can start to see how it might be broken up. Fine dining, you can tell. It's formal. Yes, they provide alcohol, but tickets are very high versus quick service. All right, so these are our fast food restaurants. Generally, no alcohol. Generally, extremely informal. Come on now, you know what I mean. It's informal. And the ticket per person can be small. Notice the size of this, though. Even in terms of that quick service, there's variation. So it gives you a sense that industries can break up into smaller and smaller and smaller units so as to insulate themselves from all the competition they might face. Okay, so when we do see a strategic group, they're directly competing, and they can be defined as clusters of firms within an industry that have common assets and follow common strategies, in which case they respond to each other. So this leads us to a quick overview of your strategic analysis. We can take that group that we've been talking about here, that strategic group, and we can look at these firms in terms of what has given the historical edge, something that has given them competitive advantage from the past. Their market structure contributes to how they compete. Maybe these are the 3, 4 largest firms in the entire industry. barriers to entry can be considerably high in such concentration, then we can start to look at the dynamics of these firms. So that's what I mean with the five forces. These are going to be things like how rivalry, supplier power, buyer power, substitutes, and complements are going to shape the nature of competition within this group. External forces shape competition. So all those cultural, regulatory, political, macroeconomic, environmental factors are going to shape competition. Now, what do firms do? Do they seek to span across multiple markets? Do they seek to buy up their supply chain? So vertical and horizontal integration. And lastly, we're going to say what's next. Okay, here is your task for the class. Your group's going to conduct a competitive analysis paper with those three groups or those three firms in a strategic group. You will submit one final paper. 2, you're going to create a video presentation. The software that I'm using is free, and that's what I hope you use. It is called Screencast-O-Matic. So take a look at it as soon as you can and get used to it. It's extremely simple and very effective.